The cameras caught every glare. Bright lights washed over the stage, but the real heat came from the clash unfolding at its center. Mike Pompeo leaned forward, his shoulders squared like a general preparing for battle, his voice sharp and relentless. He wasn't just questioning Jasmine Crockett's record, he was attacking it, hammering her with the confidence of someone who thought he had the upper hand. Each word carried a weight meant to wound, meant to corner, meant to humiliate. The audience stiffened, sensing the intensity rise with every accusation. This wasn't the measured critique of a seasoned statesman, it was a calculated strike, delivered with a smirk that said, "I've already won." Pompeo's tone dripped with arrogance, his interruptions growing bolder, as though volume and aggression alone could erase the facts he refused to face. But on the other side of the stage stood Jasmine Crockett. She did not flinch. Her eyes locked on him, unshaken, a quiet storm building behind her composure. Where Pompeo was fire-wild, scorching, reckless, Crockett was stone, calm, unbreakable, immovable. The contrast was undeniable. Millions at home leaned closer to their screens. This wasn't just politics, it was theater, a battle of dignity versus derision. Pompeo's words lashed out like blows, yet Crockett's silence in response was louder than his fury. She let him finish, never interrupting, never breaking eye contact. That patience that is so rare in the chaos of a live debate. Spoke volumes before she even opened her mouth. And then came the moment. Pompeo delivered what he thought was his knockout line, his voice booming through the auditorium, confident he had landed the final blow. The room seemed to tilt in his favor. Supporters erupted, certain the exchange was over. The crowd froze. Pompeo's smirk faltered. And as the silence stretched, it became clear something had shifted. The man who came to dominate now found himself staring into a silence so deafening it drowned his performance. What Jasmine said next would not only define the night it would leave Pompeo stunned, and the nation talking. But no one expected the silence that followed her reply. The debate was never just another televised sparring match. It was 2025, a year when the stakes for America felt heavier than they had in decades. The country stood at a crossroads, torn between competing visions of its identity. Every policy question was shadowed by something larger: who gets to shape the future? Who defines truth? Mike Pompeo entered the stage with the aura of a heavyweight. A former Secretary of State, a man who had once stood at the center of global power, he carried the swagger of someone used to commanding rooms. To his supporters, he represented stability, strength, and a promise to return to a harsher, more controlled America. To his critics, he was the embodiment of arrogance and an outdated order. A relic clinging to influence by force of personality and bluster. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, came armed with something less tangible but far more powerful: momentum. A rising star, a voice for communities often ignored, she symbolized change in a way Pompeo could never match. Where he spoke of tradition and control, she spoke of possibility and dignity. Her candidacy wasn't just about policy papers or committee hearings, it was about identity, resilience, and the belief that America could live up to its own promises. That night, under the relentless glow of the cameras, their confrontation became more than a clash of records. Pompeo's attack was not just a challenge to Crockett's history, it was an assault on the very idea that new voices, new perspectives, and new identities had a rightful place at the table. His words carried the weight of decades of entrenched power, as though to say, "You don't belong here." But Crockett's presence on that stage proved otherwise. She didn't shrink under his fire, she stood taller. For millions watching at home, immigrants, women. But the same qualities that made Pompeo a hero to some made him a lightning rod for criticism. His tenure was riddled with controversy, accusations of politicizing foreign policy, clashes with journalists, and a combative style that seemed to thrive on confrontation. He didn't just debate opponents, he bulldozed them. He turned press briefings into sparring matches, foreign visits into dominance displays. For Pompeo, politics was not about dialogue, it was about victory. That instinct to dominate carried into every arena he entered. Even before his time at state, Pompeo's years in Congress revealed the same streak. He relished fiery floor speeches, sharp criticisms, and moments where he could paint opponents as weak or dangerous. It wasn't enough for Pompeo to disagree, he had to dismantle, discredit, and diminish. He thrived on the roar of his base, the applause that followed a well-placed jab, the satisfaction of leaving a rival visibly rattled. And yet, beneath the veneer of strength lay contradictions that critics never stopped pointing out. Pompeo often spoke of values, of faith, of integrity. But investigations into misuse of resources during his time at the State Department cast shadows on that image. His ties to partisan power struggles raised questions about where his loyalty truly lay, to principle, or to ambition. He positioned himself as a defender of American tradition, but his vision of tradition often meant exclusion, often meant shutting doors to those who didn't fit his idea of belonging. By 2025, Pompeo's name still carried weight, but also baggage. He was a figure who divided sharply, admired by those who saw him as a fighter, distrusted by those who saw arrogance masking insecurity. Every glare he threw across the debate stage carried the weight of this history. Every interruption reminded audiences of a man who had spent his career overpowering rather than listening. And that night, in front of millions, Pompeo's old habits flared to life. The smirk, the cutting interruptions, the rising voice that it was the Pompeo his supporters adored and his critics loathed. He came armed not only with talking points but with the sheer force of personality honed through years of combat in the political trenches. He wanted the audience to see him as the seasoned warrior and Jasmine Crockett as the upstart challenger. But arrogance has a way of becoming its own weakness. In his determination to dominate, Pompeo underestimated the power of restraint, the strength of calm. He believed volume could overpower truth. He believed swagger could outshine composure. He believed experience automatically outweighed conviction. That miscalculation would cost him. Because history has shown us that the loudest voices, the ones who bark, shout, and sneer, often mistake noise for persuasion. They forget that people can see through the bluster. They forget that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. Pompeo roared that night, louder and louder as the debate wore on. But as the world would soon witness, the louder he roared, the more fragile his position became. Yet history shows that those who roar the loudest are often the first to fall silent. Before she ever stood under the blinding lights of a nationally televised debate stage, Jasmine Crockett's story was already being written in the quiet corners of America, the kind of places where resilience is not a choice but a necessity. Born into a working-class family, Crockett grew up in a world where every dollar stretched thin and every opportunity had to be fought for. She watched her parents juggle jobs that never seemed to pay enough, yet they never let hardship rob them of dignity. Her childhood was marked not by ease, but by lessons in grit, in sacrifice, in the belief that justice was not something handed down from the powerful but something clawed toward by the determined. While other children were shielded from the weight of society's inequities, Crockett felt them pressing on her shoulders early. She saw how friends were treated differently based on the color of their skin, how neighbors lived under rules that seemed to change depending on who was enforcing them. These weren't abstract political debates, they were daily realities. And rather than harden her into cynicism, those realities fueled her resolve. Education became her weapon of choice. Crockett excelled in classrooms where expectations for her were low, proving again and again that brilliance was not bound by background. She pursued law, not for prestige but for power, the kind of power that could shield the vulnerable, confront injustice, and speak for those who had been silenced. As a young attorney, she fought case after case for clients the system had nearly written off. Tenants harassed by landlords, workers cheated of wages, young people profiled and arrested without cause, Crockett stood with them all. It was in those courtrooms that her signature strength began to show, a calm that unsettled opponents who expected rage, a poise that drew more weight than shouting ever could. She never needed to match aggression with aggression. Her strength was quieter, steadier, more enduring. The louder her adversaries grew, the more powerful her silence became. That authenticity propelled her into politics. Unlike career politicians who rehearsed every line, Crockett spoke from lived truth. She didn't need to imagine what injustice felt like, she had lived alongside it. She didn't need to guess at the struggles of working families, she had carried them. Constituents saw not just a representative but a reflection of themselves. And that reflection inspired loyalty that no poll could measure. By the time 2025 arrived, Crockett had become more than a rising political star. She had become a symbol. For immigrants who came with nothing but dreams, for young people demanding change, for communities long dismissed by Washington's power brokers, she embodied the possibility of a new kind of leadership. Where others postured, she persisted. Where others thundered, she listened. This was the contrast that electrified the debate stage. On one side stood Mike Pompeo, armored in years of power and sharpened by combative instincts. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, carrying scars that had forged resilience and values that could not be shaken. He represented the America that clung to control through fear. She represented the America that believed dignity was power enough. And it was her journey that every trial, every courtroom battle, every moment of being underestimated that prepared her for the moment Pompeo came swinging. His words were sharp, his tone domineering. But she had faced far worse in her life, systemic barriers, entrenched injustice, a world that told her no before she had the chance to ask. Each of those moments had built an armor invisible to the cameras but stronger than any political resume. Viewers didn't just see a politician that night, they saw a woman who had walked the path of struggle and turned it into strength. They saw someone who embodied the values America claimed to hold but so often betrayed. Fairness, courage, dignity. And as Pompeo launched his fiercest attack, what he didn't realize was that he was not facing an untested opponent. He was facing the sum of all those battles, the embodiment of all those lessons. Crockett's calm wasn't weakness. It was mastery. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. It was this very journey that armed her with the words Pompeo could never counter. The light seemed to burn hotter as Pompeo pressed his attack. His voice rose, carrying through the auditorium with the force of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He leaned in, repeating the same accusations again and again, determined to corner Jasmine Crockett into a defensive stumble. Every sentence sharpened into an accusation, every pause filled with the kind of smirk that dared her to interrupt. This was Pompeo at his most familiar. Combative, relentless, convinced that dominance equaled victory. He spoke over the moderators, cut through Crockett's time, and hammered the same themes with growing volume. "You've failed your constituents," he barked. "You've got no record to stand on." His words weren't just arguments, they were weapons, swung wildly but with the confidence of someone certain they'd land. The audience shifted in their seats. Some cheered, emboldened by Pompeo's bluster. Others frowned, uneasy with his aggression. But no one could look away. At home, millions sat glued to their screens, pulses quickening with every rising octave in his voice. This wasn't policy anymore. It was spectacle, a raw test of willpower. And yet, through it all, Crockett did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on Pompeo, her expression calm, her hands steady at the podium. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't meet arrogance with arrogance. Instead, she absorbed every word, every jab, like a mountain facing the storm. Unshaken, immovable. That composure became its own kind of weapon. The more Pompeo barked, the more glaring the contrast became. He looked rattled, almost desperate to provoke. She looked unbothered, grounded, as though she had already decided how this exchange would end. Viewers leaned forward, waiting for her to break, but she never did. Each repetition of Pompeo's accusation seemed to land with less force, bouncing off her silence and falling flat. The power in the room was shifting, subtly at first, then unmistakably. What was meant to be an onslaught began to look like overcompensation. The audience could sense it. The way desperation hides behind noise, the way weakness dresses itself in aggression. The moderators exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene. Social media lit up in real time. Why isn't she answering? How is she so calm? The tension became unbearable, the silence stretching like a taut string ready to snap. Pompeo raised his voice one final time, delivering what he believed was the finishing blow. His words echoed through the hall, leaving a heavy stillness in their wake. For a moment, it seemed as if he had seized the narrative, as if his force had drowned out her presence entirely. And then, Jasmine Crockett moved. She shifted ever so slightly toward the microphone, inhaled slowly, and let the silence linger a beat longer, pulling every eye, every ear, back to her. The stillness was no longer Pompeo's, it was hers. Then, with one deep breath, she began her reply. Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her poise unshaken, her gaze locked squarely on Mike Pompeo. The room stilled. Viewers at home sat frozen, leaning forward in anticipation. For several seconds, she said nothing. That silence wasn't hesitation, it was power, carefully wielded. And when she finally spoke, her words landed like precision strikes, not wild swings. Mr. Pompeo, she began, her voice steady, low, measured, you've spent the last 10 minutes shouting at me. But shouting, she paused, letting the words hang in the air, doesn't make you right. The audience gasped. The camera zoomed in on Pompeo, his jaw tightening, his smirk faltering just enough to betray the crack forming in his armor. Crockett continued, her tone deliberate, each phrase sculpted like a blade. You call yourself a defender of truth. Yet history remembers the deals you made, the promises you broke, and the investigations you ducked. You attack me because you cannot defend yourself. The crowd murmured, the tension mounting. She let the noise swell, then cut clean through it with another line that stung. You say I've failed my constituents. But here's the difference, I know their struggles, because I've lived them. I don't need to raise my voice to prove my worth, I prove it by showing up, every single day. Applause rippled through the hall. Pompeo shifted, straightening his tie, gripping his podium tighter. His eyes darted toward the audience as if searching for confirmation that he still had control. But the cameras captured everything, the clenched jaw, the stiffened shoulders, the smirk that no longer reached his eyes. Crockett didn't let up. She leaned slightly forward, her delivery gaining rhythm, each word sharp, each pause devastating. You talk about strength. Yet strength is not belittling others. Strength is not hiding behind power. Strength is standing firm when the odds are stacked against you, when people like you tell people like me to sit down and stay quiet. The hall erupted, gasps mingling with cheers. Viewers online clipped the moment instantly, hashtags firing across platforms, hashtag Crockett exposes Pompeo, hashtag mic drop moment, hashtag unforgettable debate. And then came the moment that froze Pompeo in place. Crockett's voice softened, cutting deeper with calm precision. You say I don't belong here. But this stage, this country, this future. It doesn't belong to you, Mr. Pompeo. It belongs to all of us. And no amount of shouting will change that truth. A standing ovation began in the crowd, some rising to their feet, others pounding applause. The moderator's gavel tried to regain control, but the eruption was unstoppable. The cameras caught every angle. Close-ups of Crockett's calm face, wide shots of an audience electrified, a slow zoom on Pompeo's stunned expression as the applause thundered around him. His body language told the story. The shoulders that had once pressed forward now slumped back, the hands that had sliced the air now gripped the podium for stability, the eyes that had flashed with dominance now blinked rapidly, searching for composure he couldn't reclaim. Crockett allowed the applause to crest, then raised her hand slightly, signaling for quiet. The crowd obeyed. When she spoke again, the hush amplified her words tenfold. "You came here tonight to shout me down. You thought your history, your resume, your volume would be enough. But the truth is simple, dignity will always outlast arrogance. And America is watching." The line landed like a hammer. Gasps rippled again, followed by another wave of applause. Pompeo's lips tightened, but he didn't interrupt. For the first time all night, he couldn't. And Crockett wasn't done. Her rhythm built toward a crescendo, each sentence layered with moral authority that exposed the fragility behind Pompeo's aggression. "You claim to fight for America, but what you fight for is yourself. You speak of values, but you bend them when it suits your ambition. You wear power like armor, but real strength isn't in armor. It's in truth." A beat of silence. She let it linger, then delivered the final cut. "And tonight, Mr. Pompeo, the truth stripped your armor away." The crowd exploded, cheers drowning out everything else. The moderator leaned in, voice nearly lost in the roar, reminding the audience to remain respectful. But the energy was uncontrollable. Social media feeds were already flooded, clips of Pompeo's faltering smirk, side by side with Crockett's piercing gaze, reaction videos of viewers shouting, "savage," and jaw-dropping, into their phones. Pompeo tried to recover, clearing his throat, shifting as though preparing to speak. But the cameras caught the hesitation. The man who had roared minutes earlier now found himself muted, overshadowed, exposed. Crockett stepped back from the microphone, her expression composed, her breathing even. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The weight of her words hung in the air, undeniable. The silence after her final line was louder than his entire attack. The debate ended, but the story was only just beginning. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop counterattack flooded timelines across the country. On Twitter, hashtags blazed into the trending column, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag Pompeo silenced, hashtag truth over arrogance. The exchange wasn't just a highlight. It was the highlight, the kind of viral lightning strike that electrifies the entire political landscape overnight. Millions who hadn't even watched the debate live woke up to feeds saturated with Crockett's calm takedown. TikTok stitched her final lines into montages of cheering crowds. Instagram Reels replayed the exact moment Pompeo's smirk collapsed into silence. On YouTube, reaction channels exploded with commentary. This wasn't just a reply. It was a reckoning. Commentators across the spectrum couldn't ignore it. Progressive pundits celebrated it as a generational shift, dignity triumphing over bombast. Late-night hosts turned Pompeo's stunned expression into punchlines, showing freeze frames of his face followed by laugh-track roars. Even neutral analysts admitted that the optics were devastating. One remarked, "In politics, perception often outweighs policy." And tonight, the perception was clear: Pompeo lost the room, and Crockett owned it. But the reaction wasn't limited to pundits. Everyday Americans felt the moment ripple through them. For young people, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, Crockett's composure was more than strategy. It was validation. One viral tweet captured the sentiment. Commentators across the spectrum couldn't ignore it. Progressive pundits celebrated it as a generational shift, dignity triumphing over bombast. Late-night hosts turned Pompeo's stunned expression into punchlines, showing freeze frames of his face followed by laugh-track roars. Even neutral analysts admitted that the optics were devastating. One remarked, "In politics, perception often outweighs policy." And tonight, the perception was clear: Pompeo lost the room, and Crockett owned it. But the reaction wasn't limited to pundits. Everyday Americans felt the moment ripple through them. For young people, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, Crockett's composure was more than strategy, that it was validation. One viral tweet captured the sentiment: "She stayed calm, she stayed true, and she exposed him without ever raising her voice." That's power. Memes spread like wildfire. Someone overlaid Crockett's words with thunderclaps, turning her pause before the final line into a cinematic trailer. Another stitched Pompeo's aggressive shouting into the sound of a malfunctioning car engine sputtering out, ending with Crockett's calm delivery. Laughter and pride blended together in digital spaces, creating a cultural moment larger than the debate itself. Yet beneath the humor was something heavier: vindication. Communities long told that calmness equals weakness suddenly saw Crockett prove the opposite. Her silence, her restraint, her ability to let Pompeo implode under his own arrogance became a model of strength. Parents showed their kids the clip, saying, "See? You don't have to yell to be powerful." Crockett's words didn't just dismantle Pompeo, they elevated everyone who had ever been underestimated, shouted down, or dismissed. That's why the clip resonated so deeply. It wasn't about policy minutiae. It was about identity, about who gets to stand tall in the face of derision, and about reclaiming truth from those who try to distort it with volume and swagger. The political ripple effect was immediate. Donors called Crockett's team within hours, sensing the momentum. Grassroots organizers flooded her campaign with support, calling the debate the spark we've been waiting for. Even some critics admitted, albeit grudgingly, that Pompeo had underestimated his opponent and paid dearly for it. By the next morning, major newspapers ran headlines echoing the viral moment: "Crockett silences Pompeo in debate showdown, a viral takedown shifts the race, dignity beats arrogance in prime time." What had started as just another debate had morphed into a defining national conversation. And in living rooms, classrooms, and community centers, people replayed the clip not just for the drama but for the meaning. It felt like a collective win affirmation that America still had space for voices rooted in authenticity, not intimidation. But as the nation laughed at memes and retweeted Crockett's lines into eternity, a quieter realization began to surface. This wasn't only about one candidate's victory over another. It was a mirror, reflecting something deeper about where America stood and where it was headed. Because beneath the memes and tweets lay a deeper lesson for America. When the dust settled, the debate was remembered not for the questions asked, nor for the policy points scored, but for the way one moment distilled a universal truth. Crockett's calm, steady presence stood in stark opposition to Pompeo's storm of accusations. In that clash, America witnessed a lesson as old as democracy itself: arrogance may roar, but dignity endures. Crockett reframed the confrontation, not by gloating or mocking, but by elevating it. She reminded the audience that strength isn't measured in volume, but in conviction. This was more than a debate stage, one commentator later reflected. It was a mirror held up to America. And in that reflection, the nation was forced to ask, which path defines us? The path of insults? Or the path of integrity? Her composure resonated because it reached beyond the political. It touched something universal. Every immigrant family that had ever been told to stay quiet saw validation in her unshakable poise. Every working-class parent teaching their child that dignity matters more than pride saw their values embodied on national television. Every young person searching for examples of leadership saw that leadership need not be loud to be powerful. In a country too often fractured by shouting matches, Crockett's restraint became radical. Her words offered more than rebuttal, they offered reflection. Justice, she seemed to imply, is not just about laws. It's about how we treat one another when we disagree. Dignity is not a luxury. It's the foundation of democracy. And Americanness is not defined by who shouts the loudest, but by who holds true to their values when tested. That's why the silence after her final line mattered so much. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of recognition, full of reckoning, full of a truth too powerful to be drowned out by bluster. In that silence, America remembered that progress is forged not in arrogance, but in resilience. The lesson lingered far beyond the debate hall. Viewers carried it with them, sharing the clip not only because it was dramatic, but because it spoke to something they wanted to believe about themselves, about their country. That no matter how loud the noise becomes, dignity can still cut through. That no matter how strong the bully appears, calm strength can still disarm them. And as the nation replayed the moment, as hashtags turned into headlines, something shifted in the air. Crockett's voice, once underestimated, now carried the weight of something larger than politics. It carried the echo of a people ready for a new kind of leadership. Because in the end, this wasn't about Pompeo losing his composure. It was about America finding its reflection in a woman who refused to bend, who refused to bend, who refused to meet insult with insult, who showed that silence, when grounded in truth, can be the loudest sound of all. And in the silence, a new voice of leadership emerged. Section 9, Outro and Call to Action, 300 words. Mike Pompeo attacked with all the force of his trademark bluster. But it wasn't the roar of his accusations that history will remember. It was the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's reply. A silence so profound, it echoed louder than his entire attack. In that moment, something shifted. A debate turned into a defining scene, a clash turned into a lesson, and a voice once dismissed stood tall as a symbol of what leadership can and should be. This is why her response matters. It wasn't simply about Pompeo's aggression being exposed. It was about America witnessing the power of dignity standing firm against arrogance. It was about proving, in front of the nation and the world, that calm strength will always outlast reckless noise. If you believe in that truth, if you believe dignity must always defeat arrogance, then don't let this moment fade. Share this video so more people can see what happened. Subscribe to this channel to keep amplifying voices that rise above the chaos. And be part of this movement that says leadership should inspire, not intimidate. Because when we stand together, when we honor integrity over insult, we write a story bigger than any debate. We write the story of a country that chooses justice, chooses courage, chooses the strength of silence over the weakness of hate. And maybe one day, when history looks back at this moment, it won't just say that Crockett replied to Pompeo. It will say that America listened. And found its better self. The cameras captured it. The nation felt it. And now, the choice is ours. Will you carry it forward?